Julian had built his name carefully over many years. To the city, he was a respected hotel owner, a man who invested in property and security companies, someone who appeared in business magazines and charity events. But behind that clean image was a past full of hard choices, dangerous meetings, and nights where trust could cost a life. Julian had learned to watch people closely. He believed first impressions mattered, not because they showed perfection, but because they revealed honesty. On this quiet afternoon, he walked into one of his busiest hotels with his assistant, Grace, moving through the lobby with the calm confidence of someone who owned every brick in the building. The air smelled of polished wood and fresh coffee, and the sound of rolling suitcases mixed with soft music. Julian noticed everything, as he always did. Emma stood behind the front desk, adjusting some paperwork and checking reservations. She was not trying to stand out. Her clothes were simple, her hair neatly tied back, and her expression focused. She had been working at the hotel for only 3 months, but she treated the job seriously. Every guest mattered to her, whether they stayed 1 night or 10. Emma came from a modest background, and this job was important. It paid her rent, helped her save for evening classes, and gave her a sense of independence she was proud of. She believed that small efforts, repeated daily, could slowly change a life. As Julian approached the desk, Emma finished helping a tired couple and gave them clear directions to their room. Her voice was polite and calm, never rushed. Julian paused nearby, pretending to check his phone, but in truth he was observing her. He noticed how she listened carefully, how she maintained eye contact without being bold, and how she smiled only when it felt natural. Many people smiled too much when they saw him, hoping to impress or gain favor. Emma did not know who he was, and that made the moment feel honest. Grace leaned slightly toward Julian and whispered, "She's new, but reliable. No complaints so far." Grace was practical and sharp. She trusted facts, not feelings. Julian nodded but kept watching. Emma finally looked up and met his eyes. For a brief second, she felt a strange tension, not fear, but curiosity. There was something calm yet heavy about him, as if he carried many stories without sharing them. Julian gave a small smile, the kind he rarely used, and Emma returned it politely before looking back down at her work. Later that afternoon, a minor issue arose with a guest's reservation. Emma handled it patiently, checking the system twice and offering a solution without blaming anyone. Julian watched from a distance as she solved the problem smoothly. It reminded him of how rare it was to see someone choose calm over panic. In his past life, mistakes often led to shouting or worse. Here, Emma simply fixed what she could and accepted what she could not change. After the situation was resolved, Julian approached the desk again. This time, he spoke. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low and controlled. Emma looked up, slightly surprised. "Thank you," she replied simply. She did not ask who he was or why his approval mattered. That simplicity caught his attention even more. Grace introduced him briefly as the owner. Emma's eyes widened for just a moment, then returned to calm. "Nice to meet you, sir," she said, standing a little straighter but not changing her tone. That small reaction stayed with Julian. Many people became nervous or overly respectful when they learned his position. Emma showed respect, but she did not lose herself. She did not suddenly become someone else. Julian appreciated that more than praise. He asked her how long she had worked there. She answered honestly, explaining that she was saving money to study and hoped to move into hotel management one day. There was no flattery in her words, only quiet ambition. As Julian walked away, he felt something unfamiliar. It was not attraction in the usual sense, and it was not pity. It was interest mixed with respect. He saw in Emma a reflection of the life he might have lived if his choices had been different. Someone working step by step, believing effort mattered more than power. Grace noticed his silence and said nothing, understanding that some thoughts needed time. When Emma finished her shift that evening, she told her sister Olivia about the hotel owner she had met. Olivia listened carefully and reminded her that powerful people often came with complicated lives. Emma agreed. She did not dream or imagine anything beyond the moment. To her, it was just a meeting, a calm conversation, nothing more. Still, as she prepared dinner that night, Julian's steady eyes came back to her mind. That first meeting was simple, careful, and real. No promises were made. No lines were crossed. But in that quiet hotel lobby, two very different lives briefly touched, and neither of them walked away unchanged. In the days that followed their first careful meeting, life returned to its usual rhythm, yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. Julian found himself thinking about the hotel more often than necessary, not because of profits or management issues, but because of the calm presence behind the front desk. He did not act on these thoughts immediately. Years of experience had taught him the danger of rushing emotions, especially when power created an uneven ground. Emma, on the other hand, continued her routine without expecting anything unusual. She arrived early, checked schedules, greeted guests, and left on time to attend her evening classes. Still, she noticed small changes around her. Grace asked for her opinion once or twice during staff meetings, and managers seemed more attentive to her work. Emma assumed it was simply because she was doing her job well, not because someone important was watching. The company dinner was announced as part of a routine staff appreciation event. It was held in one of the hotel's larger halls, decorated with soft lights and simple elegance. Emma helped arrange seating cards and ensure that everything ran smoothly. She wore a modest dress and felt slightly out of place among managers and executives, but she reminded herself that she had earned her position there. Julian arrived later than most guests, dressed in a tailored suit, his expression serious as usual. Grace stayed close, quietly handling introductions and logistics. When Julian entered the room, conversations softened, and heads turned, but Emma was focused on her task, carefully placing the last card on a table. Julian noticed her immediately. Not because she was trying to be noticed, but because she wasn't. She moved with purpose, checking details, adjusting chairs, and offering help without drawing attention to herself. When their eyes met again, it felt different this time, as if both of them were aware that this moment carried more weight than before. Julian approached her during a brief pause in the event, choosing a moment when they could speak without an audience. The air between them felt quiet but charged, like a room waiting for a sound. They spoke first about simple things, the event, the guests, the long hours. Emma's answers were honest and direct. She did not exaggerate her efforts or complain. Julian appreciated that. He decided, perhaps without fully planning it, to test the boundary between formality and truth. With a small, unexpected smile, he asked, "Is your bed big enough for two?" The words were bold, but his tone was not threatening or careless. It was almost playful, as if he wanted to see how she would respond rather than claim anything. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Emma felt the weight of the question, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was direct. She did not panic or blush dramatically. Instead, she looked at him carefully, reading his face, his posture, his intent. She had grown up learning to trust her instincts, and her instinct told her that this was not a trap, but a moment of honesty. Julian met her gaze, fully aware that his next seconds depended on her response. Then, calmly and clearly, he replied himself, softening the moment, "Only if you're the one beside me." The words hung between them, not as a demand, but as an invitation that respected her choice. Grace, watching from a distance, felt a quiet shock. She had never seen Julian speak this way, especially not in public. Yet there was no arrogance in him now, only openness. Emma took a breath and nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She did not promise anything. She simply said, "I appreciate honesty." That was enough. No further explanation was needed. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but the atmosphere had changed. Julian returned to his seat, thoughtful and unusually silent. Emma continued her duties, her mind steady but alert. She knew that a line had been drawn, not crossed, and that whatever followed would depend on choices made carefully. When the event ended, she went home and spoke to Olivia, sharing the moment without drama. Olivia listened closely and advised caution, reminding her that words could be easy, but actions showed truth. Julian, alone in his office later that night, replayed the conversation in his mind. He did not feel regret. Instead, he felt something closer to responsibility. He understood that from this moment forward, he would have to be better than his past, not just for Emma, but for himself. What had changed the air that night was not the bold question, but the respect that followed it, and both of them sensed that. Life would not return to being quite the same again. After the night of the company dinner, both Julian and Emma returned to their daily lives, but neither of them felt the same inside. The conversation they shared had not been dramatic, yet it carried a quiet seriousness that stayed with them. Julian became more aware of his surroundings and his decisions. Every contract he reviewed, every meeting he attended, he asked himself whether it matched the future he claimed to want. He had spent years believing that power was the only shield against loss, but now he began to understand that power without purpose was empty. Emma, meanwhile, continued working her shifts, greeting guests with the same calm respect as before. She did not seek Julian out, nor did she avoid him. She believed that if something was real, it did not need to be chased. Still, she found herself thinking more deeply about what kind of life she wanted and who she wanted to become. Emma shared her thoughts with her sister Olivia during a quiet dinner at home. Olivia listened carefully, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her eyes serious but kind. She had seen Emma struggle for years, balancing work, studies, and responsibility. Olivia reminded her that men like Julian often carried heavy histories and that those histories could affect everyone around them. "You deserve peace," Olivia said gently. "Whatever you choose, make sure it doesn't cost you yourself." Emma nodded. She respected her sister's wisdom and knew that love, if it ever came, should not feel like a risk to her values. She decided to move slowly, letting actions speak louder than words. Julian, on the other hand, spoke to Grace one evening after a long day of meetings. Grace had been with him through many phases of his life and understood his silences better than most. Julian admitted that he felt torn between who he had been and who he wanted to be. Grace did not judge him. Instead, she reminded him that change was not proven by words or sudden gestures, but by consistent decisions made when no one was watching. She told him that if he truly wanted a different future, he would need to protect it from the same habits that once defined him. Julian accepted her words with respect. For the first time in years, he felt accountable not to fear or ambition, but to something human. Their interactions remained respectful and limited. Julian would occasionally stop by the front desk, not to impress or control, but to observe the daily life of the place he owned. Emma noticed that he listened more than he spoke. He asked questions about staff schedules, working conditions, and guest feedback. Slowly, small improvements followed. Extra staff were hired to reduce long shifts, and training programs were approved. Emma saw these changes and understood that they were not done for show. They were thoughtful, practical steps that made real differences in people's lives. One afternoon, Julian invited Emma for coffee in the hotel cafe, a public and simple place. There were no expensive gestures, no private rooms. They spoke openly, sharing pieces of their lives without pressure. Emma talked about her dreams of moving into management and one day running a small hotel of her own. Julian spoke about mistakes he could not erase but lessons he refused to ignore. There was no romance in the usual sense, only two adults choosing honesty over image. When they parted, neither promised anything more than continued respect. As weeks passed, trust grew quietly. Emma saw Julian handle conflicts with patience rather than force. Julian saw Emma remain true to herself, never using their connection for advantage. Olivia noticed Emma's calm and slowly eased her worries. Grace, observing everything, felt a cautious hope. She knew how fragile change could be, but she also knew when it was real. This phase of their lives was not filled with dramatic events, but with steady choices. Each decision, small and large, shaped the path ahead. They were learning that real connection was not built on bold words or power, but on consistency, boundaries, and mutual respect. In choosing to move slowly, Julian and Emma were doing something far more difficult than rushing forward. They were choosing responsibility, and that choice quietly transformed both of their worlds. As the quiet understanding between Julian and Emma deepened, the world around them began to respond in ways neither of them could fully control. Change, especially slow and meaningful change, rarely went unnoticed. Within the hotel, whispers started to move from one corner to another, not loud enough to confront, but sharp enough to sting. Some employees admired Emma's professionalism and saw her as an example of hard work being recognized, while others questioned whether her growing visibility was earned or influenced. Emma sensed the shift in atmosphere almost immediately. She remained polite and focused, but the warmth that once felt natural now sometimes carried hesitation. She understood that perception could be as powerful as truth, and she worked twice as hard to ensure her actions remained clean and unquestionable. For her, dignity was not something to be defended with words, but protected through behavior. Outside the hotel, pressure came from a darker direction for Julian. Old contacts, men who had benefited from his former way of doing business, noticed his distance. Meetings were declined, deals were delayed, and familiar shortcuts were suddenly closed. Some took offense, others felt threatened. Julian received calls late at night, reminders of favors owed and alliances once formed. Each call tested his resolve. Walking away from the past was not as simple as selling businesses or changing routines. It required saying no to people who were used to obedience and loyalty built on fear. Julian felt the weight of those choices heavily, knowing that every step toward a cleaner life carried risk. Still, for the first time, he did not face that pressure alone. Grace stood firm beside him, advising caution but never encouraging retreat. She reminded him that standing still was sometimes more dangerous than moving forward. Emma felt her own form of pressure at home. Olivia watched the news closely, aware of how quickly public stories could twist private truths. One evening, she gently confronted Emma, not with anger, but with concern. She asked whether Emma was truly prepared for the attention and uncertainty that came with someone like Julian. Emma listened quietly, understanding that Olivia's worry came from love, not judgment. She admitted that fear existed, but so did clarity. She was not chasing power or comfort. She was simply responding to honesty with honesty. Olivia, seeing her sister's calm confidence, softened. She reminded Emma that strength did not mean ignoring danger, but recognizing it and choosing wisely. That conversation strengthened Emma's resolve rather than shaking it. Julian decided that avoidance would only allow rumors and doubts to grow. Instead of hiding, he chose transparency. He invited Emma to a simple dinner at a small family-owned restaurant far from his usual circles. There were no guards nearby, no luxury displays, just quiet tables and ordinary conversations around them. During that evening, Julian spoke more openly than ever before. He explained the full weight of his past, the mistakes that could not be undone, and the responsibility he now carried to do better. He did not ask for forgiveness or assurance. He only asked to be understood. Emma listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. When he finished, she told him that truth did not erase consequences, but it created a chance for trust. She made it clear that her future would never be built on fear or secrecy. And Julian accepted that boundary without argument. Back at the hotel, Grace took quiet action. She strengthened internal policies, improved communication, and made sure that professional lines were clearly drawn. She understood that protecting Emma also meant protecting Julian's efforts to change. By reinforcing structure and fairness, she reduced opportunities for gossip to become damage. Slowly, the workplace settled, not because questions disappeared, but because consistency replaced uncertainty. People began to see that Emma's role remained unchanged and that Julian's leadership was evolving in visible, responsible ways. This period tested all of them deeply. Emma learned that respect had to be maintained daily, not demanded. Julian learned that leaving the past behind required courage stronger than any threat. Olivia learned to trust Emma's judgment, and Grace learned that loyalty could exist without fear. Pressure continued to exist, but it no longer controlled them. Instead, it shaped them, forcing each choice to be deliberate. In facing that pressure together, they moved closer to a future defined not by power or rumor, but by accountability and quiet strength. Time moved forward quietly, not with sudden miracles, but with steady progress that could be felt more than seen. The hotel continued to run smoothly, and the changes Julian had started slowly became part of its normal rhythm. Staff morale improved, long hours were reduced, and training programs gave employees a sense of future rather than exhaustion. Emma completed her evening courses with determination, often studying late into the night after long shifts, driven not by ambition alone but by self-respect. Julian never interfered in her work or studies, and that restraint meant more to her than grand gestures ever could. Olivia watched these months pass and noticed that Emma seemed stronger, calmer, and more certain of herself. The fear she once carried softened into awareness. And awareness turned into quiet confidence. Grace, observing everything from close range, recognized that what was happening was not a romance built on excitement, but a partnership forming through patience and discipline. Julian faced one final test when an old associate offered him a deal that promised fast profit but carried familiar shadows. Accepting it would have been easy, almost automatic in his former life. Refusing it meant risking anger, loss, and possible retaliation. He spent a long night considering the choice, thinking about who he was becoming rather than who he had been. By morning, he declined the offer calmly and without explanation. That decision marked a turning point. The past did not disappear, but it loosened its grip. For the first time, Julian felt free not because he controlled others, but because he controlled himself. Grace supported the decision fully, knowing that this single choice carried more weight than months of careful planning. One evening, after a long but peaceful day, Julian invited Emma to walk with him on the hotel's rooftop balcony. The city light spread out below them, steady and distant, reflecting a world that continued moving regardless of personal struggles. There was no dramatic speech, no bold questions this time. They spoke about ordinary things, about work, about Olivia's hospital shifts, about Grace's plans to finally take a vacation. In that simplicity, Emma realized how far they had come. Julian looked at her with the same quiet smile he had offered during their first meeting, a smile that no longer carried uncertainty. He did not promise perfection or protection from hardship. Instead, he offered something smaller and stronger: consistency, honesty, and presence. Emma accepted not with excitement, but with trust. What bound them together in the end was not passion or power, but choice. A choice to stand beside one another without control or fear, to face consequences without denial. And to value peace over pride. Olivia came to respect Julian not because of his wealth, but because of his restraint. Grace remained a steady presence, proud not of success alone, but of integrity earned the hard way. In a world where dramatic endings were common, their story settled into something quieter and more real. It was a simple promise, lived daily rather than spoken loudly, proving that even lives shaped by shadows could move toward light when guided by patience, respect, and the courage to change.